You're listening to the WORKSPACE Show, the podcast that looks closely at trends, changes, and all the small or big revolutions that affects the way we work. My name is Greg Micyk, and for more than 20 years, I have been actively helping to grow many workplaces around the world. I'm sitting down with managers and executives and all those that shape the way people work to talk about insights, experience, and predictions on what comes next. All that to help others understand the constantly shape-shifting workspace. In today's episode, I will be talking to Christianna Polydorou, whose expertise lies in international recruitment. She has agency, entrepreneurial, and in-house recruitment experience in different industries and across multiple markets. Previously, she worked at Klarna, one of Europe's leading unicorns, and currently leads a team focused on hiring and strategic consulting within talent for the John Lewis Partnership in the UK. She's passionate about exploring more sustainable ways to hire top talent in Europe and beyond. Hi, Christianna. Nice having you here in the studio. So you described yourself on LinkedIn as a bridge builder. So where's the gap?
So I think the gap is between top talent and companies looking to hire them. And I think it's not that easy nowadays to secure top talent because there's so much competition and everybody's sort of competing for the same people. And then also finding a way to make sure that the hiring process is actually a good experience for candidates, but also that in general, like from a strategic perspective, that hiring practices are sustainable. So, you're not just hiring 100 people because you need them this year and then next year you don't need them anymore and then layoffs happen and all of this. So that's something that I feel quite passionate about is, thinking about the future as well and not just thinking about the next 6 months.
So what's the real influence of the TA team on that sustainability? If you consider that there's a lot of decisions, strategical decisions made outside of the team, for example, budgets, for example, sales targets, how can TA support that sustainability and predictability to make sure that we don't have such aggressive layoffs as we have at the moment?
So when you look at like the higher levels of recruitment, so you usually get like a head of talent in companies that are maybe like a little bit bigger. They do a lot of strategic work, so like strategic workforce planning and that sort of thing, where they actually sit with head of growth or, the founders of the company and forecast, okay, what do we need in the next 6 months, in the next year or so, and what makes sense from a hiring perspective? Like, does it make sense to try to hire everybody in 6 months? Or can we maybe like drag that out to 12 months and prioritize which roles are more important to hire for right away and which ones can wait until later? Because obviously, if you decide that you want to hire a lot of people in the next couple of months, then you need to also hire more recruiters in order to make that happen. So I think that maybe not more junior recruiters, but at like higher levels of recruitment where you are quite involved in these sorts of conversations, you do have a bit of impact in this. And what we're seeing in the industry now as well is that there's a new trend of recruitment that's sort of a hybrid model that's not really like in-house recruiters, but they're not an agency either. So that's similar to what I'm doing right now, is where you just, you're embedded within a company, but you're not directly employed by the company. And then it's like a subscription model that can be scaled up or scaled down. And I think that's so much more sustainable because we're there when you need us to help you hire, but when you don't need to hire, which is so totally normal in the cycle of companies, sometimes you're growing and sometimes you're not, then you just scale down. And then once you need us again, we come back in again. So I think that's sort of a model that makes sense to me.
How does this model affect the efficiency of the recruiter and also the cooperation with hiring managers? Like you said, it's a subscription model, you are there, you're not there. How does it make it as efficient as it would be an internal recruitment department that has a constant contact with the hiring managers and the whole organization?
Once you're at a certain seniority of recruiting, you also generally understand the market pretty well. And it doesn't really take a lot of time to get back into it. Mm-hmm. So if you've worked in that company before and you understand what their process looks like, or you've recruited for a similar type of role, it's quite easy to get back into it and find those types of people again. There isn't a major learning curve. So I think this plug-in, plug-out model does work pretty well. But on the other hand, of course, like somebody who's been in your company the whole time, of course, they do have an advantage. But then again, when hiring stops, it's kind of difficult to keep them motivated, because what are they going to be working on during that time? I mean, you do always have projects and other things that you can work on in recruitment to improve the process and the employer branding, the candidate experience, that sort of stuff. When hiring slows down, because usually if you have a lot of roles to hire for, you don't have the time to focus on all these other things. So it is a nice time sometimes, when you do have more free time, you can focus on all of these things. But up to a certain point, and then you just feel sort of bored. Okay, what is your role right now in the company? They're not going to be hiring for another 6 months. Like, what am I going to do during this time? So unless the company finds a way to include them in other projects, which they could actually, because I think recruiters have quite a good skill set that can be applied in different areas of the business. I think that's maybe the missing piece, is that companies haven't quite figured out how to transition the role of a recruiter when hiring switches off.
Let's talk a bit about the top talent. How their requirements and their demands changed over the last couple of years. We had COVID, now we have uncertainty of the job. So what they are after, what they are looking for when you talk to them and they are looking for a new company to work with.
Yeah, I would say, especially after COVID, people's expectations of their employer has changed quite a lot. And I was actually listening to another podcast the other day, and it was very interesting, the point that they discussed, that actually we expect maybe a bit too much from our companies at the moment, because our social lives are not as they were. Like, we don't go to the office as much. There's a lot of things that have changed in the way that we interact. And in the past, maybe before COVID, we would have maybe like a football club that we're a part of, and we would have like maybe some kind of like religious community or something else that we're part of. And we would go to the office and see people, and we'd have we'd meet our friends after work for a beer or something like that. And this is not happening as much as it used to. So people are just maybe at home the whole day, working from home, that sort of thing. And so they expect a lot more from their employer. They expect their employer to give them a sense of belonging, and to be the place where they get their social life from, and to be the place that offers them all these wellness benefits and all these extra things that where before, like, the community was giving them that. But after COVID, we've just changed our patterns of socializing, whereas now, like, we're expecting an employer to also look after our mental health and do all these extra things. So I think that is something that people do care about, especially in Berlin. Like, people do look at the culture, what are the people like, what are the benefits, what else are they offering us?
Yeah, but what's the culture if we are sitting at home, right? It is very difficult to touch it. In before, it would be, like you mentioned, I don't know, the beers on Friday, or maybe going out for the Christmas market. But what is culture now in the company? What people are looking for when they say, oh, I'm interested in the culture of your company?
I think it actually links a lot to flexible working. And just like how flexible, how tolerant your employers are of what you have going on in your life outside of work. I think that's a big part of culture nowadays.
It's interesting that you use the word tolerant. Wouldn't you agree that tolerant is very different than flexible? Like, tolerant suggests that there might be something employer might not like, and flexible is more like having flexibility and common understanding on what it actually means?
That's a very good question. And I think I actually used the wrong word. I think it's more about flexibility than tolerance. I just think, like, as an international person, for me, it's really important to work for a company that respects the fact that my family doesn't live in this country, and that sometimes, like, once a year or twice a year, maybe I want to go home to my country and work from there for like a month or something. So I guess that's part of the flexibility rather than tolerance. Depends, what they're looking for, but yeah, I think.
So what does it mean to be flexible? What kind of flexibility have you seen across different organizations?
It really depends on the company. I've seen really a range of things. I think companies have in general become more flexible, but there are always strings attached. So even in bigger companies like Klarna, that employs a lot of engineers, and I'm not particularly talking about them, I'm just saying in similar companies like that, they would have this policy where you can work abroad, but then it's limited to a certain number of days usually. And then also because of tax reasons and so on, they have to be compliant. So I think there's definitely a limit to how flexible they can be. But even looking at some companies in the UK where it's not as flexible or open as in Berlin, right? Like the culture is very different, and they're much more used to this more like corporate, going into the office, dressing up when you go to work sort of culture. Even there, it's become better, where although they still need to go to the office, it's only like once a week, as opposed to, whenever you want.
There's a lot of news about companies asking their employees to come back. A lot of them even reverting the remote or hybrid policy. Do you think this is also culturally driven? Do you think that differs among different cultures or different nations?
Yeah, 100%. I do think it's a cultural thing. So I noticed like in more English-speaking countries, it is a bit more formal. And people do generally like dress up and go to the office more often. Even in South Africa, where I'm originally from, like people are still going to the office every day. So although it changed during COVID, it's sort of getting back to where it was before, where maybe they offer now like 1 or 2 days flexibility, but it's very different to what it is here. And then I also recruited a lot in the Nordics, like in Sweden, for example, where it's also a lot more relaxed or maybe more human-centered, as it is in Germany, is what I've seen. Of course, in Germany, Germany is also like difficult to talk about as a country, because you get Berlin and then you get everywhere else in Germany, basically. And it's very different in these different areas, and also different types of companies. Like the startup scene in Berlin is also very different than if you go into, I don't know, like Mercedes-Benz or something.
Yeah, let's talk about Berlin for a second. So do you think that in times of layoffs, in times of profitability focus, not growth, do you think that this vibrant, growth-driven scene will survive?
Honestly, I think it will survive as a tech scene, at least in the next 5 years. I don't see that changing anytime soon. More and more, like I talk with some companies that are based in the US or even in the UK that are looking for, where should our European hub be? And many of them do target Berlin. They just feel like there's more talent attracted to a city like Berlin. I still think it's a great place to be for tech talent, because salaries are decent. It's actually higher than most European countries. Like the salaries for tech in Berlin are much higher than other parts, even sometimes much higher than in London. The cost of living is still relatively low compared to other European capitals. And it's a very diverse place. There's a lot happening. It's quite central in Europe. English speaking. I mean, of course, it's part of Germany, but it's so international that everyone does speak English. So it's very comfortable for international talent. And then you also have access to a lot of EU citizens, who would have the right to work in Berlin as well. So I see it continuing as a tech scene.
Okay, awesome. So I found on your LinkedIn profile a very interesting article that goes directly into the venue of our conversation. It was saying that 45% of candidates reject the job because they were unimpressed with the recruitment process. And it's a lot. I mean, it's a half of candidates that could be potentially hired. And it's a lot of money, a lot of time. So what do you think are the key reasons for those people to be unimpressed? And a follow-up question on that, do you think that it will change, that people will have less expectations because the market will be more difficult? or it's going to be even worse because only top talent will be willing to change their jobs?
Interesting. Those are two questions. So I'll go for the first question first. So I think some of the reasons why candidates would maybe withdraw from the process because they're unimpressed with it is because the process is maybe too long or too disorganized, not transparent enough. Sometimes it could be actually because of somebody that they met that maybe wasn't very respectful or kind towards them, where they just get a bad impression of what their future colleagues could be like. I've heard this quite a lot actually, where some of my friends say, oh, I interviewed at this tech company, that tech company, that they have really good reputations, but I was so surprised that the recruiter was so rude, or the hiring manager didn't even look at me, they were just busy with something else, and took a phone call in the middle of the interview, that sort of thing. And then also just not getting back to candidates in time, because generally if you are looking for a job, you would be talking to several companies, right? And you would just go for, of course, the one that is right for you, but then if you have to wait for a company to come back and you already have 2 offers, you have to make a decision. So that's, I think, part of it as well.
So how you mentioned that they can be they can meet someone they don't like, and let's skip recruiters for now. It's a first stage, right? What if they are unimpressed with the hiring manager? How the feedback loop works in that case. So do you get that feedback and you work on it, or is it something that basically it is not your area and you're not touching it at all?
I would definitely share. I would try to find out, what it was that, because generally candidates are quite honest with you, I noticed. Or maybe it's just my experience, because I'm usually very transparent with candidates as well. So I expect it to be like a two-way thing. And I always tell them, if something changes, please let me know if you have feedback. And sometimes they will tell me, oh, I didn't like what this person said, or the way that they treated me, or something like that. And then I would actually go back to the hiring manager and feed that back, and maybe do some training as well with them, some education around what is best practices when interviewing, that sort of thing. This has happened before, actually. And we did do just training sessions for hiring managers.
But that also requires a lot of openness on the other side, right? It's not easy to get feedback like that because of you, our candidate or candidates said no. So how do you build relationship with a hiring manager outside of the process of hiring? How understandable they are for that feedback, and do they expect that feedback at all?
Yeah, I guess it's not easy to hear that, right? If somebody says, oh, this thing happened and this candidate that was really great withdrew because they weren't happy. But I would just be honest with them and say, look, I know maybe you were having a bad day, or maybe you didn't realize it, but this is just the feedback I got. It could just be this one-time thing. But yeah, super happy to work with you on how we can do better next time.
And is it easier to provide the feedback as an internal employee of the company, or as this kind of a insertion agency into the company? Which is easier? There are two different relationships.
It would be much easier to provide it internally, I feel. Although it depends actually on the traditional relationship between the recruiter and the hiring manager in that company. Because for some reason, in some companies, this relationship doesn't work very well. Or maybe, the hiring managers maybe look down a little bit on the recruiters, or they don't take their feedback as very valuable because they think, oh, I know better, that sort of thing. And sometimes when it's coming from external experts, then it might be taken a bit more seriously, but it really depends on the relationship. In Klarna, for example, we had very good relationships with hiring managers. So we were very honest, transparent. We met every week to discuss the candidates, the process, all of that. So I felt super comfortable if I ever had this kind of feedback to just get on a call with the hiring manager and just tell them directly. And I feel like they did listen to that, and they did take it and apply it.
So when you think about a general place for recruiters in the company, it's not a really part of HR, right? it is it is a bit of a department. It's a huge department. So, do you see that the perception of recruiters also has changed over time, and that they have a different position, or it's actually depending on the company or the market?
It depends a lot on the company, the market, and also whoever you're dealing with and what their experience is from previous workplaces. Because I know still a lot of companies actually in Germany don't separate HR and talent acquisition. It's more of a new thing. And I think it maybe comes from like the American startup culture that it's separated, HR and TA. But I often hear like engineers or other people that maybe are not very close to the recruiting side that are like, oh, she works in HR. And then I have to correct them. I'm like, no, I don't. It's a separate thing. And I think that it still is quite new that there's this separation. And not every company has it. And in fact, a lot of companies here still do their own hiring without a recruiter. Like maybe the hiring managers or like the team lead will try to recruit their own people and then loop in somebody from HR. So I've seen that that's also still happening a lot in Berlin.
Over the last couple of years, I mean, I have been receiving every day a message from a recruitment agency. We will help you, we will support you. And obviously the times where, there was tons of candidates on the market, there was a huge need. But do you think that this very salesy approach of those recruitment agencies kind of impacted the way recruiters are perceived?
Yeah, I definitely think that recruitment agencies have a bad reputation. And I think that definitely if you think about like a recruiter, you might have had that experience and that maybe impacts your view. But to me, like it's very clear that a recruitment agency is different to somebody working in-house in talent acquisition. The role itself is quite different as well. And the thing in agencies is that they rely on getting new clients and placing candidates in order to make money. Whereas recruiters working in-house, they obviously have a fixed salary, so they just have to consistently like do a good job. But definitely I think that it has affected the reputation of a recruiter. And I think that's also why maybe they named the role differently to just saying like in-house recruiter. They would rather call us talent acquisition specialists or something like that. Maybe to try and step away a little bit from that salesy agency type recruiter.
But still, work of the TA, it is a bit of sales, right? You have your pipeline, you have your goal, you have to get a candidate, but it's not you who is closing the deal. I mean, there's a tons of stuff which is completely not dependent on you. You can find a great candidate, they are great, but in the end, the hiring manager has the say. So how do you feel about this relationship? Because it must be difficult when you deliver and in the end, it's not your decision. So how do you think that also will evolve over time?
I think in a healthy company, it sort of is your decision. Like you decide, you're a bit of a gatekeeper and you decide like who gets to come through and who doesn't, and who you decide who to present to the hiring manager and who not to. And I think if you have a good enough relationship with the hiring manager, it's more of a partnership. That's the way that I see it. It's not like I'm, your service provider. Rather, I'm your partner. We're trying to find this person together. This is what I need from you, and this is what you need from me. And we need to be aligned, and I need to understand exactly what you're looking for and not present you with people that are inappropriate or just, are not relevant to the role. And at the same time, like if I do go through all this effort and, somebody passes like different steps in the process and they meet you, you need to also have some respect for the fact that they've made it this far and not just say, oh, I didn't like this person because they didn't smile enough. So it's definitely like the relationship between the hiring manager and the recruiter is really important.
But do you think that it means that recruiters should specialize in a certain roles? Like, obviously we have tech recruiters. This is very clear. But do you think it's exactly the same thing about support, sales, HR, or operations? Because it effectively would make the conversation with hiring manager way easier,
Yeah,
right?
it's definitely better when you specialize in a certain area and that you also really understand that area. So if I'm recruiting for product, I need to really understand product and maybe even have shadowed somebody working in that for a day or two to really understand what they do. In a deeper level as well, in order to have more meaningful conversations with candidates as well. Because candidates can also see through you if you don't know what you're talking about. If you just see the role on paper, or you have like one quick conversation with the hiring manager, and then you go out there and looking for an astrophysicist or whatever, and you have no idea what you're talking about, the candidates will also have a bad impression then and be like, okay, they don't know what they're talking about. And then again, if I go to the hiring manager and present them with a candidate that's not suitable, they're going to lose respect for me and my work, because they'll say, okay, you don't understand what I'm looking for. You don't get it. So maybe I'll just go externally to an agency or something else, or just do it myself. And I think that's part of the problem.
So circling back to more current events, there's a lot of layoffs. How that affects your conversation with candidates and making sure they move through the pipeline?
Yeah, definitely. Honestly, I like to address it in the first call, even if candidates don't bring it up. If they don't ask me, how safe is it for me to join this company? What sort of security can you give me? I like to address it right away, because as somebody who's been through this process and seen a lot of people around me impacted, I think it's something really important to talk about nowadays. And as a recruiter as well, I don't feel comfortable talking to candidates when I know that there's a chance that the company's not doing super well, or they might not be able to keep them on long term. So I also try to get some sort of assurance from the hiring manager that I'm working with. So what is your company doing to make sure that this is a secure environment for people to work in? And how can I reassure people that after they join this company, especially if it's a tech company nowadays, you need to work extra hard to attract people and make sure that they feel okay joining the company. So if you have maybe some case studies or anything else that that the company has done, some measures they've taken to ensure that you won't be affected after joining the company.
But have it ever happened to you that you would have to push back to hiring managers saying, guys, we shouldn't go that fast?
This hasn't happened to me, to be honest, because I think during the time when I was hiring very high volumes, that was more like a golden time when there was a lot of free money floating around and everybody was doing well. So I guess we didn't see this coming, and we didn't know, what the consequences would be. We just saw the business is growing, it's doing really well, everything's positive. So why not hire more people? But nowadays, I would definitely caution against, high volume recruitment.
I have a last question about the diversity in European companies, how that affects the work of the recruiter. Because, obviously we speak English. It's a common language, but we don't speak it in the same way, right? We have a different understanding of certain words, of certain phrases, and also of how we speak. I mean, direct feedback, non-direct feedback, there are some nationalities not doing very well with that. There are some thriving in that. So how does this affect your work?
Yeah, it affects it quite a lot, and I'm always aware of it. Also being from a very diverse background. I never judge people based on their accent or how fluent their English is or anything like that. For me, it's more about, do they need very high fluency in order to do the job? Or is it okay if they conversational, they can speak it, and then I just focus more on their skills? So I would never let that stop them from moving on to the next round. And then I also try to speak a bit slower, make sure that I explain certain things when speaking to somebody who I know is not a native speaker. Yeah, and then diversity in general, I mean, it's such a big word, and there's so many different things to consider with diversity. But in general, I would say, European companies are quite good about that, because I think everyone, speaks good enough English, and I don't think it's a huge barrier, especially in tech. I think it's super important to hire diversely and to have different opinions, different ways of speaking, different ways of thinking. And then it's just a question of like educating. So I think you need to really like educate the whole company on like what the differences are. So when we're in Germany, this is what people are like. They will be more direct, and don't take it personally. This is just how people speak here. And it doesn't mean that they don't like you. It doesn't mean they're being unfriendly. And then again, if you are here in the German market, I often tell my UK colleagues, I'm like, don't oversell things. Like, you need to like be better at like managing expectations, being super transparent. Because if you say something's really great, it's amazing, like people won't believe you. So, I think it's a lot of education that needs to happen. And there's a really good book called The Culture Map. I don't know if you've read it. But that's something that I often introduce to colleagues when working in like a mixed environment work.
Would you already talk to the candidate about those cultural differences to prepare them for the conversation with the hiring manager or other people in the team, just to manage their expectations and to manage the way they see other people who are engaged in the process and who are a part of the company already?
That's a really good point, and I actually haven't done that to date. But it's something that I will take with me from this conversation. And I think it's definitely worth doing that, just to give them a heads up. Like, they're from this culture, so the way of speaking might be a bit different, just to be aware of that. Yeah, I think that's a good point. Never thought about that. I just sort of assume that like people that have worked internationally or that speak English or something would sort of be comfortable communicating with each other. But I never really thought about how the culture could actually affect the way that they speak
Thank you very much for the conversation. I really enjoyed it.
Thank you, me too.
And have a great day. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Greg.
Bye. Thank you for listening to another episode of the WORKSPACE podcast. If you enjoyed it, consider sharing it within your network. If you didn't, let us know so we can improve. And of course, join us next time.